Welcome to Linguistics Tube. This episode is part of my series which explores the skills involved in public speaking. Through these episodes, you will learn and practice several techniques that will allow you to perform public speeches successfully and easily. In this episode, we will continue our discussion of the structure of an argumentative speech. Specifically, we will focus on the second or middle section of the speech, in which you present your reasons why you hold your viewpoint, as well as the evidence to demonstrate why your reasons are strong. This middle section is called the body of the speech. The body is the middle of your speech, and it is the main section of your speech. In this section, you will present, explain, and justify the reasons for why you have your point of view. And remember that you state your point of view in the thesis statement. The analogy that is often used for an argumentative speech is a burger. The introduction and the conclusion are the bread, and the body is the meat. As I said in the previous episode about the introduction, an argumentative speech gets its name from the fact that you must present arguments. In this section, argument does not mean an angry disagreement with someone else, which usually involves shouting. In terms of a speech, argument is synonymous with reason. So your arguments are your reasons for why you hold your viewpoint. In a typical argumentative speech, I would expect to hear at least 2, and at most 3, detailed arguments. You can make this decision based on the requirements of your argumentative speech. Personally speaking, I prefer to hear fewer arguments with more detail than more arguments with little detail. However, if you have 3 very strong arguments to share with the audience, then it would be more effective to include them all. But how do you arrange and organize your arguments in the body section? I highly recommend that you put each argument into a separate paragraph. So, each paragraph in the body section will contain one argument. Therefore, for example, if your speech has 3 main arguments, your body section has 3 paragraphs. Sometimes, my students choose to write all 3 arguments in one huge paragraph, so that if you look at the entire printed speech as a whole, it has the burger shape that I mentioned. However, it can be very difficult to follow your arguments if they are not clearly arranged into separate paragraphs. So, even if your argument paragraphs are quite short, maybe even shorter than your introduction paragraph, don't worry, it is not a problem. Each body paragraph, so each argument, should contain the same 3 parts. Your argument must begin with a topic sentence. Then, you will support your reason. Finally, you will conclude with a wrap-up sentence. Let's now look at each section of the body in more detail. We'll start with the topic sentence and wrap up, and finish with the support. The topic sentence, which each argument must begin with, is a 1-sentence summary of that argument. Let's look at an example from the topic about long-distance relationships. The topic is, students should begin long-distance relationships when they go to university. The thesis statement is, long-distance relationships can indeed be hugely beneficial for university students, not only for the couples themselves, but also the society as a whole. And the first topic sentence is, couples will deepen their spiritual connection if they are not physically together, which is very healthy for long-term relationships. From this, we can clearly see the connection between the topic, the thesis statement, and the topic sentence, especially if the thesis statement includes a summary of the body's arguments. We will explore the support section of the body in detail soon, but for now, I can briefly say that immediately after your topic sentence, you must justify why your topic sentence is valid and correct by supporting it with additional information, detail, examples, and most importantly, evidence. After that, you will conclude your argument by presenting the final sentence of the body paragraph, the wrap-up sentence. Importantly, it is not a conclusion of your entire speech, but a conclusion of the argument. The easiest way to write a wrap-up sentence is to echo the topic sentence. In other words, it should repeat the meaning of the topic sentence. Therefore, it must not repeat the same words, it must instead use different words. To show the audience that the speaker has reached the wrap-up sentence, the wrap-up sentence should begin with a phrase that shows the result of something. For example, because of this, in a word, as a result, consequently, therefore. Do not use the phrases that you would begin the conclusion with, like to conclude or to close this off, because those sound too final and extreme for a summary of each argument. Here is an example to demonstrate this. The topic is, students should begin long-distance relationships when they go to university. The topic sentence, couples will deepen their spiritual connection if they are not physically together, which is very healthy for long-term relationships. And the wrap-up sentence, therefore, it is clear that a long-distance relationship will increase the likelihood of becoming spiritually connected. Before we move on, I should say that some textbooks state that the wrap-up sentence is optional. Personally, I disagree, because I think the wrap-up sentence has a very important function to show the audience that your argument has nearly finished and to provide them with a convenient summary of the main theme of your argument. This will undoubtedly increase the argument's persuasiveness and the persuasiveness of your speech overall. In between the topic sentence, which is the introduction to your reason, and the wrap-up sentence, which is the conclusion of your reason, is the justification of your reason. To do this, you could choose to support it with additional information or a more detailed explanation about your reason. However, both of these are much less effective than the most effective form of support, which is called evidence. We will now explore this in detail. We can define evidence as a piece of information that helps us to make a conclusion or judgment about something. When I hear this word, I don't think of argumentative speeches. I immediately think of this word in a legal setting. It reminds me of courts, lawyers, justice, and a criminal trial which determines guilt or innocence. In this setting, a lawyer will use evidence to convince the judge that someone is either guilty or innocent of a crime. Therefore, the judgment that must be made is whether he or she is guilty or innocent, and the information that is used to help make this judgment is evidence. In an argumentative speech, the speaker is similar to a lawyer, because the speaker must use evidence effectively to convince the audience that his or her argument is a good argument. A more academic way to say a good argument is a valid argument. So, the speaker must convince the audience that his or her arguments are valid, and this is achieved by using evidence effectively. To summarize, you must use evidence to make your reasons more convincing, understandable, and clearer for the audience. But how do we determine whether something is valid? This is actually a huge question which would take a very long time to adequately explain here. To keep it short, I'll just say that to be valid, which simply means that the argument is acceptable to use in your speech, an argument must be rational. In other words, if an argument is rational, then it becomes valid for you to use in your speech. So, the next question is, what makes an argument rational? I believe there are two main aspects. To be rational, it must be logical and reasonable. To be logical, the evidence that supports the argument must be connected in a way that makes sense. For example, my argument is that it is dangerous to drive now. My evidence is that it is always dangerous to drive when it is snowing, and it is snowing now. In this example, the evidence logically connects to the argument. They would not logically connect if you used the same evidence, but instead argued that it is safe to drive now. If an argument is reasonable, then it is fair and sensible. For example, without a time machine to go into the future, I can reasonably argue that the sun will rise tomorrow, because it has risen every day in history, and there is no evidence that anything has changed that could cause the sun to not rise. An unreasonable argument is to claim that the sun will not rise tomorrow, because we cannot predict the future. There are many types of evidence, and some types are more valid than others. In fact, we can roughly put the major types of evidence into two groups: less valid evidence, which are more subjective types of evidence, and more valid evidence, which are more objective types. Please pause the video now to think of types of evidence that can be used in an argumentative speech. Let's now have a look at more and less valid types of evidence. There are three types of less valid evidence. Firstly, analogies, which are a specific type of comparison. Understanding how to use these effectively requires some explanation, so we will learn more about them later in this episode. Secondly, you could use anecdotes, which are a story about something from your own experience, or a story about the experience of friends or family, or a famous story about a celebrity, for instance. Finally is the least valid type of evidence, which is called common sense. I will show you many examples of common sense in this episode, and will explain why it is a very poor quality form of evidence. It is certainly the least valid evidence on this list. You can use it when having a friendly debate with some friends, but you must avoid it as support for an argument in a public speech. In the more valid group, there are four common types of evidence to use to support your arguments. Firstly, you could refer to an important or famous event or phenomenon, which your audience will be familiar with. This could be something that was widely reported in the news, for example, and it could either be current or historical. Next, you could use the opinion of an expert in the field of your speech topic, such as a university professor or a famous organization. You could quote the expert directly or paraphrase his or her words. Thirdly, statistics from a valid source are perhaps the most convincing source of evidence, as long as they come from a high-quality source. Thus, this is one of the best types of evidence to use. Good examples are a scientific report, a book, an academic article, and a newspaper article. Finally, you could use a theory, a principle, or a model. These certainly require some explanation, and you will find this later in this episode. In general, theories, models, and principles are an idea or a set of ideas that explain how something works and why something happens or exists. They are very useful forms of evidence. There are thousands of theories, models, and principles about every subject. So of course, you can only use one if you already know about it. So, there are 7 basic types of evidence, or 6 if you ignore common sense. But which types should you rely on to create persuasive speech? To answer this, let's briefly return to the context of a criminal trial. If a man is accused of murder, then the victim's lawyer will use evidence to convince the judge that the man is guilty. The lawyer could use many types of evidence, but some will be more convincing than others. For example, the lawyer could read the testimony of a witness who claims that he or she saw someone who looks like the accused man running nearby the scene of the murder. However, the witness is not 100% certain that the person running away was the accused man, nor is the witness 100% certain that the person was running away directly from the scene of the murder. This is called circumstantial evidence, and is certainly not valid enough to reasonably decide whether the man is guilty. In contrast, if there were many direct witnesses who stood in front of the accused man while the murder happened, they all filmed it on their phones, and there were security cameras which filmed the murder, then this evidence is far more convincing and therefore valid. Using this evidence alone, the accused man would most likely be found guilty. Back to argumentative speeches, this means that more valid or objective evidence alone can effectively support an argument, but less valid or subjective evidence cannot support an argument on its own. Therefore, you should only use objective evidence as the core support for your arguments. So, when can you use subjective evidence? For example, if you have an amazing anecdote that you really want to share with the audience, then you can use it to add additional support to the argument that was already supported with objective evidence. Thus, you can use an anecdote alongside a statistic, for example. However, do remember that you cannot use common sense because it is too weak for an argumentative speech. Let's now explore 2 of these types of evidence in more detail: analogies and theories. Firstly, we'll discuss analogies, which can be a useful type of evidence to support an objective type of evidence. Most simply, an analogy is a form of comparison. You will use an analogy if your argument is difficult to understand or contains information that is unfamiliar to your audience. By using an analogy, you make your argument easier to understand. To demonstrate how to use comparison to make your argument easier to understand, let's use the argument that Toyota cars are better than BMW cars. For the sake of this example, although I just made it up, let's say that the important background information which the audience should know is that Toyota cars are more expensive but better quality, and BMW cars are cheaper but lower quality. if I am listening to your speech in the audience, then you will need to work harder to help me understand your arguments, because I know nothing about cars, especially not the differences between different brands of cars. And if the topic is unfamiliar to me, then I am less likely to understand and thus be persuaded by your arguments. You can use an analogy to help me understand your argument by comparing the principles of the difference between the two brands of car to something that is easier to understand, or something that the audience is more familiar with. Before we look at what comparison you could make, I should say that an analogy is not your only option in this situation. Instead, you could simply provide more information to the audience and explain that Toyota cars are more expensive but better quality, BMW cars are cheaper but lower quality. However, that is not very interesting. Instead, you can use an analogy which also compares two types of object, because this is the same principle as which car is better. The analogy that I have chosen is the choice between buying two types of simple product. The product I have chosen is apples, because I'm sure that all of us have wanted to buy apples before and needed to make a choice in the shop about which apple to buy. I'll now read the analogy. Toyota cars are like the perfect, crunchy, organic, glistening red apple at the top of the pile of apples, whereas BMW cars are like the rotting, soft, small apples that have been sitting at the bottom of the pile for weeks. Any reasonable shopper would buy the fresh, perfect apples instead of the rotting ones that should be thrown away. Similar to the apples, few people would purchase a poorly made, lower quality car. As you can see, at the end of this example, the speaker returns to the discussion about cars and links the discussion of apples to it. After this, the audience should understand the principles involved in the speaker's argument. Next, let's discuss another of the 6 types of evidence in detail. I realize that theories, models, and principles sound very abstract, so let's look at some of my favorite ones. These will not be appropriate for every speech topic, but they will demonstrate why theories, models, and principles are a valuable form of evidence, instead of statistics from a scientific study, which are easy to overuse. I have divided the theories that I will share with you into 3 groups: general, economic, and psychological theories. My explanations of these are deliberately simplified, so I might have omitted some details. Thus, if a theory particularly interests you, then please research it yourself to learn more about it. Firstly, here are some interesting theories that can help to explain phenomena in life in general. The first theory is called Occam's razor. This theory states that if something happens and there are 2 possible explanations, the explanation that requires the fewest assumptions is usually correct. In other words, an explanation is more unlikely if you need to make more assumptions. Or even more simply, the simplest explanation is most likely to be correct. Let's look at an example. If you see a woman running towards a bus at a bus station, you might create 2 explanations. Firstly, she is running away from the ghost of her dead husband, whom she just murdered. Secondly, she wants to catch the bus before it leaves. The first explanation requires several assumptions. The woman was married, she is a murderer, ghosts exist, ghosts are evil and want revenge, and so on. The second explanation does not require any assumptions. Therefore, the second one is more likely to be correct. Next is the principle of least effort. This theory states that if an animal, person, or even a machine must do something, it instinctively does it in the most effortless way. This theory can explain a variety of phenomena, but it is commonly used to explain why English is becoming simpler over time. For example, because it is more common to make plural with s, words like gooses instead of geese have slowly appeared, and will eventually replace the more difficult to remember word. Also, past tense verbs like swam and dove are slowly being replaced by swimmed and dived. Finally, regarding pronunciation, letters can swap in a word to become easier to say. For example, wasp used to be wops, bird used to be brid, horse used to be hross. The third theory I want to share with you is the Pareto principle, which is also known as the 80-20 rule. Its name comes from the fact that, for many events, roughly 80% of the effects come from 20% of the causes. For example, it is often observed that when students are working in groups, 80% of the work is completed by 20% of the group members. Secondly, in an agency which rents apartments, 80% of the sales come from 20% of the agents. And thirdly, in a noisy primary school classroom, 80% of the noise comes from 20% of the children. Godwin's law is a very interesting theory. If you are not from a Western country, then you have probably not experienced this due to cultural differences. But in the West, it is really common. During a discussion, either on the internet or in person, if a person begins to lose the argument, it is increasingly likely that he or she will call the other person a Nazi. Because the Nazis did terrible things, a person during a debate uses this attack to quickly end the debate. This is because no one wants to be compared to a Nazi, so he or she will probably stop debating with the losing person. Next is Murphy's Law. This law states that anything that can go wrong will go wrong. It is a rather tongue-in-cheek theory, but this kind of thing definitely happens to all of us occasionally. Here are some examples. Firstly, if you are not looking for something, it is exactly where it should be. But when you finally need it, it has disappeared and you can't find it. Secondly, after you get home from the supermarket, you remember that you forgot to buy the only item that you wanted to buy. Thirdly, your favorite product always gets discontinued or changed to become worse. Now, let's look at the second group of theories, which originated from the field of economics. Even though they originally explained economic phenomena, they can be used to explain a wider range of phenomena in the world. The first theory is called the law of diminishing returns. This states that, during a process of doing something or making something, if you keep increasing the input, at some point the output will decrease. In other words, more input eventually leads to less output. To be honest, the economics examples are difficult for me to understand, so I prefer to use non-economics examples. Firstly, if you study for 8 hours instead of 4 hours, you probably won't have double the amount of knowledge, because you will get tired, distracted, and bored. Secondly, regarding weightlifting, your muscles are not twice as big if you do 6 days a week instead of 3 days a week, because your muscles grow afterwards when you are resting. So, if you do not have enough time to rest, your muscles will not grow as fast. The second theory is the decoy effect. I'll explain this with an example. You go to a shop to buy a cup of coffee, and you want a medium-sized cup. However, the shop only has 2 sizes. Small is £2, and large is £6. It is very likely that you will choose the small, because the large seems too expensive. However, if there is a medium size which costs £4, it is likely you will choose the medium. But the shop really wants you to buy a large size and spend the most money, so a medium size actually costs £5.50. In this situation, it is very likely that you will buy a large size, because it is only 50p more. In conclusion, a business can make more money if they convert the customer from someone looking for a cheap product into someone looking for value for money. The theory of supply and demand states that if the supply of something is the same but the demand for it is lower, the price will decrease. And if the demand is higher, the price will increase. Let's look at 2 examples. Firstly, if there is a drought which reduces the amount of strawberries that are grown and available to buy, there are fewer strawberries than the number of people who want to buy them. As a result, the price of strawberries increases dramatically. Secondly, in the off-peak season, few people go on holiday. As a result, the price of hotel rooms in tourist areas decrease, because there are more hotel rooms than the number of tourists. Let's now look at the third group of theories, which can be used to explain psychological phenomena. Firstly is the sunk cost effect. This theory states that people often continue to do something only because they have already invested time and or money into it, even though they should logically stop doing it. Here are 3 examples. Firstly, if you are late for an appointment and you've waited for the bus for 30 minutes, it is very likely that you will continue to wait for the bus even though you could get a taxi and not miss your appointment, only because you already invested 30 minutes. Secondly, if you are unhappy in your relationship, you are more likely to stay together if you have been together for 3 years instead of 3 months. And thirdly, if you have clothes in your wardrobe that you don't like and don't wear anymore, you are more likely to keep the expensive ones than the cheap ones, even if you don't wear either of them. The second theory related to psychology is called groupthink. This states that the desire to be a member of a group who all agree with and support each other is more important than the desire to make rational, logical decisions. So, it is quite common for a group to eventually make dangerous, harmful decisions simply because no member wants to disagree with the other members. Most of the examples I can think of are very culture-specific, so it might not make much sense. Here is just one example. In 1986, the USA's spaceship Challenger exploded just after it launched. It was later revealed that the engineers secretly disagreed with the launch, but they were too scared to tell the managers as they thought they might get fired if the launch were delayed. The third theory is called confirmation bias. This states that people are more likely to pay attention to information that supports their beliefs and opinions, and ignore information that challenges them. For example, firstly, when people know that I am left-handed, they often say, "Oh, that makes sense, because you play the piano, and left-handed people are very creative." When they say this, they ignore the fact that I am more interested in writing, logic, and science. which are characteristics associated with right-handed people, than I am interested in the piano. They do this to fit my information within their existing beliefs about left versus right-handed people. Here is a second example of confirmation bias. There is a big problem with gun control in the USA. Regarding a case from a few years ago, a gunman attacked a school and murdered innocent children. The murderer was eventually killed by a teacher who had a gun in his office. Afterwards, two members of the public hear about the case. Person A supports guns, and Person B opposes guns. Both people will use the same story to support their viewpoint. Person A focuses on the fact that the teacher killed the gunman because he had a gun, and Person B focuses on the fact that the children would be alive if the gunman did not have a gun. Both people focus on different information to support their opposite viewpoints. The final theory I want to share with you is called the bystander effect. It states that individuals are less likely to help a victim when other people are also there. The effect is that they just stand and watch, or more recently, film it on their phones. The fewer the number of people, the more likely they are to help the victim. For example, if someone faints in a crowded public place, the people surrounding him or her are less likely to help, compared to someone fainting in a rural area when only one other person is nearby. In that situation, the one person is much more likely to help. Let's look at an example of each type of evidence. For this, I'll use the topic, smoking should be banned in all public places. Importantly, this topic is not smoking should be banned. Therefore, this topic is not about banning smoking in general. It is instead about banning it in public, such as in parks, offices, restaurants, and schools. Therefore, it focuses more on non-smokers than smokers. Firstly, let's look at an example of an analogy. There are many possible ways to begin your analogy, but I have written two suggestions for you. These are, let me use an analogy to better illustrate my point, or let me use an analogy to better explain why. I'll now read an example of an analogy. Let me use an analogy to better explain why. In Singapore, chewing gum cannot be used in public, and in Malaysia and even Shanghai Disneyland, the fruit durian is banned. In all three cases, this rule was made to avoid the damaging effects these products have, not on the users themselves, but on the people around them. I believe these examples are exactly the same as smoking in public, which evidence clearly shows can increase the risk of serious health issues. Next, here are two examples of an anecdote. Again, here are some suggestions of how to begin your anecdote. For instance, let me give an example. My two examples are, for example, whenever I go to a restaurant and there are people smoking near me, I feel that I am breathing their smoke. This makes me a smoker, even though I don't want to be. And let me give an example. Jackie Chan used to spend a lot of time with smokers when making movies, and he said he found it very difficult to breathe and often felt ill. Remember that you cannot use common sense in argumentative speeches. However, I have included two examples here to show you what a common sense piece of evidence looks like, so that you will avoid using evidence like this by mistake. Usually, common sense evidence begins with, everyone knows that, it's common knowledge that, it's obvious that, it is universally understood that. And here are two examples. everyone knows that secondhand smoke is very unhealthy for non-smokers. It's common knowledge that secondhand smoke increases your risk of cancer. The problem with this type of evidence is that your argument is not obvious only because you tell the audience that it is obvious. Instead, you must convince the audience with good quality evidence. For the next type of evidence, you can use any event or phenomenon that your audience will be familiar with, either current or historical, or local, national, or international. Your topic and argument will determine what event is the most relevant. For this topic, I have chosen an international event from recent history. I will read it now. There is a similar situation which I believe is particularly relevant here. Several countries have already enacted smoking bans in public places, such as the UK. Since the ban in the UK, the number of smoking-related illnesses, such as cancer, strokes, and heart disease, have significantly decreased in both smokers and, more importantly, non-smokers. By the way, you can start this type of evidence with phrases like, "There is a similar situation which I believe is particularly relevant here," or "Similar situations can support my point." Here are two examples for the type of evidence which calls upon the opinion of experts. It could begin with, according to quote. The book or website or article, and the name of it, says. I will now read the examples. According to the Environmental Protection Agency, secondhand smoke causes approximately 3,000 lung cancer deaths in non-smokers each year. And, to quote Dr. Wang, who treats lung cancer caused by smoking, there is a huge risk to non-smokers from accidentally breathing in other people's smoke. Making it illegal to smoke in public will improve the public's health. Finally, here are two examples of statistics. In the first, the numbers are whole numbers, and in the second example, they are percentages. I'll now read them. But firstly, you can begin this type of evidence with phrases like, a recent study by your source and or the year the source was published shows that, or according to a survey by the source and or the year. Here are the examples. A recent study by the Chinese Ministry of Health shows that secondhand smoke causes about 250,000 breathing infections in children every year, which leads to about 15,000 hospitalizations each year. According to a survey by China Daily in 2018, smokers are 50% more likely to get cancer than non-smokers. This isn't unusual, but secondhand smokers, who don't smoke at all, are 30% more likely to get cancer. In order to be as persuasive as possible, it is important to use emotional examples, which will make the audience feel guilt, sadness, regret, and so on. In the first example, the speaker did not just choose to talk about infections in people, but only infections in children. On the topic of secondhand smoke, this is very emotive because children, especially young children, usually do not have a choice about where they are. If their parents take them to a restaurant and there are smokers at the table next to them, the children won't tell their parents that they need to leave. So, they must sit there and breathe in the dangerous air. Even worse, because they are only children, they probably don't know that it is harmful. So, you can see that you must think carefully about how to be as persuasive as possible, and using examples which cause the audience to feel emotional is a great way to do this. I cannot easily think of how to use a theory, model, or principle to support the topic about smoking in public places, so let's use a different topic. Let's say that the government in your country were thinking about changing the law to allow children to take 1 week off school every year so that their family can take a holiday during the off-peak season. The government want to do this because low-income families cannot afford to take a holiday during the more expensive holiday season, when the schools are closed. If you wanted to create an argument on this topic, you might claim that low-income families can only afford to go on holiday during the off-peak season because holiday prices are lower during the school semester. But the point is, how do you know that this claim is correct? You need something external to support your claim. Without it, this is a perfect example of conjecture. We will learn about conjecture soon, but basically, conjecture is a claim that lacks evidence to support it. Conjecture usually comes in the form of common sense, especially if the claim begins with, "Everyone knows that," or "It's common knowledge that." Of course, not everything needs to be supported by statistics from a scientific study. Instead, it is acceptable to use principles, models, and theories as support for an unsupported claim. So, here is a claim with conjecture, because it uses common sense to support the argument. Children should be allowed to take 1 week off for a family holiday during the school semester each year because low-income families can only afford to go on holiday during the off-peak season. This is because, as everyone knows, holiday prices are lower during the school semester. Specifically, the claim is holiday prices are lower during the school semester. We could use the results of a scientific study to support the claim. Children should be allowed to take 1 week off for a family holiday during the school semester each year because low-income families can only afford to go on holiday during the off-peak season. This is because, according to a survey conducted by the Ministry of Tourism in 2019, holiday prices are lower during the school semester. However, a theory, model, or principle is also acceptable and interesting. Remember, the claim is holiday prices are lower during the school semester. The issues here are the price and the date of holidays. Specifically, holiday prices are lower when fewer people take holidays, and holiday prices are higher when more people take holidays. Which of the theories that we learned about in this episode could explain and support this? Please pause the video and find the most appropriate theory. The best theory is one of the economic ones, supply and demand. In my opinion, this theory can adequately support the claim. My question for you is, can you tell us why supply and demand appropriately supports the claim that holiday prices are lower during the school semester? Please pause the video and decide why this theory can support the claim. Remember that, if the supply of something is the same, but the demand for it is lower, the price will decrease. And if the demand is higher, the price will increase. So, holiday prices are lower when fewer people take holidays, and holiday prices are higher when more people take holidays. Holiday companies make their holidays more expensive when more people want holidays because of their endless quest for profit. We can use this theory to support the unsupported claim by briefly inserting the name of the theory and a brief explanation into the claim. like this. Children should be allowed to take 1 week off for a family holiday during the school semester each year, because low-income families can only afford to go on holiday during the off-peak season. This is because, as the economic theory of supply and demand states, holiday prices will be lower during the school semester because fewer people take holidays during this time. It's really that simple. With the insertion of the name of a theory, model, or principle, and a quick explanation, an unsupported claim has been supported. In the previous discussion, we saw a topic sentence that was supported with common sense. To remind you, the topic sentence was, children should be allowed to take 1 week off for a family holiday during the school semester each year because low-income families can only afford to go on holiday during the off-peak season. The support for this was a piece of common sense, which was, this is because, as everyone knows, holiday prices are lower during the school semester. Common sense is a claim that the speaker states is not only true, but obviously true. We saw some examples of this for the smoking in public places topic earlier in this episode. The result of the use of common sense as support for the topic sentence is that the entire argument becomes a piece of conjecture. Conjecture is an opinion that lacks valid evidence. Instead, the speaker assumes that the opinion is true, because the speaker assumes that the audience already agrees with the opinion. So, in an argument with conjecture, the speaker makes a claim, but has no evidence to prove it. Therefore, instead of using external, objective evidence to convince the audience that the arguments are valid, the speaker relies on his or her own reasoning and his or her own explanation about what he or she assumes to be true. Therefore, the speaker makes the claim because he or she assumes it is true, but does not present evidence to prove that it is true. This is a catastrophic weakness that will guarantee a weak speech. The problem with using common sense to support an argument is that it is very unconvincing, and even a little lazy, for the speaker to assume that he or she is correct simply because the claim seems obvious. Even if something seems true, you cannot assume that it is true. In other words, even though we probably all agree that holiday prices are lower during the school semester, without any external evidence to support that claim, the speaker cannot objectively make that claim. And the overall problem with conjecture is that you cannot assume that the audience knows and agrees with your common sense. Because of this, phrases like "everybody knows that" and "it is universally understood" are absolutely inappropriate in an argumentative speech, because you cannot simply claim that your beliefs are obvious and known by everyone and hope that the audience agrees with you. Instead, every claim you make must be supported by something outside of your own beliefs. And by that, I mean that you must have objective external support for every claim that you make. Therefore, the ultimate goal of an argumentative speech is to convince the audience that your viewpoint is valid by using high-quality reasons and support those reasons with high-quality evidence. Remember that there are 4 options for valid evidence: statistics from a high-quality source like a university, newspaper, or organization, expert opinions, events and phenomena, or theories, models, and principles. A speech would be very weak if it uses common sense to support its arguments, resulting in conjecture. It is best to assume that the audience holds the opposite viewpoint to you, so you must work extra hard to prove to them that you are correct. If you keep this in mind, you won't make any arrogant assumptions about the audience agreeing with your unsupported viewpoint. In conclusion, to be clear, you cannot use this type of evidence in an argument for an argumentative speech. If you can only think of a common sense claim to support your argument, then it is easy to turn your common sense claim into a piece of external evidence by making up a quote or a statistic. We saw this in the previous discussion. For example, a claim with common sense, such as, "This is because, as everyone knows, holiday prices are lower during the school semester," can become, "This is because, according to a survey conducted by the Ministry of Tourism in 2019, holiday prices are lower during the school semester." This is a simple fix, but it is very effective. The final thing I want to say about evidence is what to do if you cannot find a high-quality piece of evidence to support your reason. In this situation, if you are in an English exam with no access to the internet, it is perfectly acceptable to invent a fictional study by a university, newspaper, or an organization, and therefore invent your own statistics, quotes, anecdotes, and expert opinions. This is because the exam is not testing your ability to research accurate information, it is testing your ability to use argumentative skills. However, importantly, you must not invent evidence for other homework or assignments, because those assignments do test your ability to research accurate information. Of course, you must make your evidence realistic and believable in order to be persuasive. According to research, is not specific, interesting, nor convincing. Instead, you absolutely can use sentences like, according to an article published in the BBC in August 2019. This is supported by a statement from the WHO in January 2020. According to a 2019 study by Cambridge University. According to a survey by China Daily in 2019. According to a report by the World Health Organization in 2019. Remember, if you invent your own evidence, then it must be specific. This is the end of the episode about the body section of a public speech. If you liked what you heard, then you can find more videos in my public speaking skills series, as well as other series on the topics of English and linguistics. Thank you for watching.